much. So my name is Xuan Fu, and I'm a PhD student from Johns Hopkins University. And today I'm going to talk about how snakes traverse large obstacles in complex 3D terrain. So as we all know, snakes are very good locomotors in complex 3D environments. They're able to generate thrust by deforming its elongated body into different shapes. And a lot of studies have focused on their locomotion on flat planes with small height variation. And they have found some basic gaits such as lateral undulation, concertina, rectilinear, and sidewinding. Some researchers also looked into their locomotion on flat surfaces with simple obstacles and found that they can use lateral oscillation to push against obstacles for thrust. However, different from those arboreal studies, very few terrestrial studies consider terrains with large height variation or the role of vertical bending. And in a previous study in our lab, we found that snakes can use lateral undulation and vertical bending to traverse large steps. Basically, to a partition is split into three sections. The anterior and posterior sections use lateral oscillation, and the middle section can leverage to bridge the height difference. And as the snake moves forward, these patterns travel down the body. And in Henry Astley's lab, we recently found that the snakes can also use vertical bending alone to propel itself against the environment to move forward. For example, when the snake is moving over a horizontal ladder, it is able to generate sufficient thrust from vertical bending. They confirmed it by measuring the reaction forces on these pegs, as shown here. So the yellow curve here shows the forward and up force, and the propulsive impulse is more than double of the braking impulse, which implies that the snake generates propulsion in the vertical plane. They also found that the snake can do similarly in a tunnel with one triangular block. Initially, the snake uses a concertina gait to slowly move forward, but it is no longer needed when the snake reaches this triangular block, and it can just use vertical bending to move forward. These are described in detail in Drastovsky's paper. So here comes our hypothesis, whether vertical bending can provide propulsion similarly as how lateral oscillation do in complex environments. For example, in environment like a rubble. So to test it, we first build a rubble-like terrain with low friction acrylic blocks. Their heights follow a normal distribution. We then attach B tags to each block and track them using 12 cameras. We drove 3 snakes to traverse the terrain in 33 trials, and then track the B tags attached to their body. Then we interpolate the continuous body using a custom method. This method has a high accuracy compared to the previously used B-spline method, and the error is well below the radius. In this way, we can use the measure kinematics to kind of quantify the contact between the animal and the terrain. So here are some observations. First, to make it easier to observe their behavior, we color-coded each terrain block. A block is colored in red if it is below the a block is colored in red if it is higher than the average height of the nearby body, and colored in white if it's below the body and support the animal. It's colored in blue if it's below the body but not contacting it, and colored in gray for other blocks. So we found that the animal usually travels with very little slip, and it looks like it's moving in a tube. Also, it tends to go through valleys, which means it tends to go over the lower blocks of the terrain. So previous studies have found that the snakes can generate propulsion from lateral bending and pushing against obstacles. And from Henry's previous experiments, we also know that vertical bending may be able to do similarly. So for this case, is lateral bending alone sufficient, or is vertical bending also used to provide thrust? Unfortunately, we can't measure forces yet, but with 3D reconstruction, we can begin to understand the interaction and quantify the possible forces to test this hypothesis. So from the 3D reconstructed data, we can determine different types of body-terrain contact. So the simplest case is that the body is not contacting any terrain. And then we have the cases that the body is pushing against a vertical wall. And I have to mention that because the acrylic surface is quite smooth, so here we ignore all the friction. And also the stiff body can push against a vertical edge like this, or push down on a horizontal surface and generate a normal upward force. And this is the case that the snake is pushing against a horizontal edge, and the possible force will be in this direction. So because we are interested in how the snake generates forward thrust, so we only focus on cases with horizontal force components, which means these three cases. And then from the kinematic data, here is an example of the quantified row of body along the entire body. So aside from the terrain color code, we also color code these rows with different colors. For example, we use red to color code bodies that are possibly pushing the blocks vertically, and use green to color code bodies that are potentially pushing terrains laterally, and blue for the bodies that are sitting on horizontal plane and providing upward normal force, and black for the other suspending part. So from these reconstructions, we can evaluate how much does vertical and lateral bending parts possibly contribute to thrust. First, for each body segment, we can check whether it is possible to generate a force that's the same direction as the center of mass velocity. If this angle is smaller than 90 degrees, then we think this point maybe generate a contribution. Otherwise, it's possibly not generating any net positive contribution. Then for both vertical and lateral pushing points, we look at all the body segments along the body and count how many of them can possibly generate forward force. For example, here we have 3 vertical pushing points and 2 green lateral pushing points. And for the red vertical pushing points, only 2 of them, this one and this one, that can possibly generate forward force in the same direction as center mass. So we see that at this video frame, the sum of possible contribution is 2. And similarly, for the lateral pushing points, at this video frame, the sum of possible contribution is 1. And here shows a possible contribution we inferred from lateral and vertical bending part in one trial. So as you can see, sometimes the lateral bending part contributes more, and sometimes the vertical bending part contributes more. And here's an example from the trial I just showed. One lateral bending is not always sufficient. So as you can see that the green lateral pushing part here can only possibly generate forces in these directions, but none of them are in the same direction as the overall moving direction, which means that from the lateral pushing parts at this video frame, they may not be able to get enough propulsion force. However, from the red pushing points here, they might be able to get the thrust they need. And then we calculated in how many video frames out of 4 that lateral or vertical bending can possibly contribute more. So for all the trials, 38% of the video frames has a vertical bending parts contribute more, and for the rest of them, lateral bending part may contribute more. We also estimated how much forceful contribution out of four does each part provide. For example, vertical bending here in all the trials provide about 41% of the forceful thrust, and lateral bending here provide the rest of them. So as a summary, snakes can traverse low friction rock terrain without much slip, and both lateral and vertical bending are important in providing forward thrust. Still, we need some force measurement to test our hypothesis. So we're also developing the sensorized terrain and sensorizable physical model tested. And for more details, there is another talk tomorrow about it. And that's all for my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. We have one question from Kirsty Wan, and they ask, great talk. Are you tracking the tail movement too? If so, what contribution does that make?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So unfortunately, because it's very hard to attach those detail markers to the tail and to the head, so these two parts are actually not tracked in our experiment. So there is a possibility that they may provide some extra thrust, but for now, with this kinematics data, we can't know that. But we hope that in the future we can use force measurement to see whether they have, like, they play an important role in providing more thrust.